Willkommen. Vielen Dank, dass Sie alle gekommen sind. Excuse my German. Tihei Māori ora. He mihi mihi ki ngā hunga mate. Mātou I tangi nā koutou katoa. We would like to acknowledge those who have passed on. Te whare e tune, tēnā koe. Te papa kei waho, tēnā koe. Tēnā koe rau rangatira. Helen, tēnā koe. Otto, tēnā koe. Who else is here? Yes. Ben, Lisbeth. Tēnā kōrua. Mike, tēnā koe. Nano and Claudia, tēnā kōrua. Susan, tēnā koe. Helen, David, tēnā kōrua. Helene, tēnā koe. Olga, tēnā koe. Ngā iwi e hui hui nei. Joran, tēnā koe. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So I've been acknowledging the house that we're in here, the land outside, and the chiefly people who are present, and you know who you are, and I'm sorry if I missed out on any of you, but I greeted you all anyway. So, Areta.
Mihi mihi ki ngā hunga ora. We turn to the living. We'd like to give a warm acknowledgement to Pinakothek der Moderne, Karina Rosner, Petra Holscher, Sabine Roko, and Dinoa Zumlung, and Creative New Zealand for enabling this event and supporting us to be here. Humphrey Tate is here with us to represent our National Arts Council. We greet our international friends of New Zealand Jewellery and acknowledge our New Zealand colleagues who have travelled 18,000 kilometres to join us for this event. We congratulate Monique Strayer for her achievement.
Mi. He mihi mihi ki ngā kaupapa o te rā. Since 1982 and 1990, when Herman Junge, then Otto Kunzli, visited New Zealand, we've had contact with Munich via Schmuck. Since 1989. That was because Herman asked Warwick, Freeman and I to be in Schmuck that year, and then subsequently Peter Nicol asked me to be a selector for New Zealand. And then that went on for a number of years, selecting 2 each year. And I think probably other countries selected 2, until it became open selection. And when it became open selection, of course, the first one to get in was Lisa Walker and Penelope Barnhill, which was great. And my first visit to Munich was in 2011, when Helen Britton asked Fingers to be represented along with her gallerists at her book launch at Gallery Handwerk, where I met Wolfgang Löscher and Eva Sarnowski. Kia ora, Thomas. Yes. Then in 2014, Warwick Freeman and Carl Fritsch curated Wonder Room of the exhibition which the Dowse Art Museum in New Zealand toured to Gallery Handwerk with the assistance of Creative New Zealand. There I met Corina Rosner, Petra Holscher and Sabine Rökel, and Prof. Florian Hufnagel was able to give, and I was able to give them the book Between Tides that Damien Skinner had wrote about my work. And this led to, as it's been mentioned before, Creative New Zealand sending an archive of publications to De Nuya Samlong, which Warwick Freeman, Carl Frisch and Damien Skinners and others had gathered together. I sent the book Fingers, Jewellery for Aotearoa New Zealand, 40 Years of Fingers Gallery, which is there, by Damien Skinner and Finn McCann-Jones, and that led to the invitation for Areta and I to talk here, thanks to Petra. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Areta.
Whakarongo aki au ki te tangi atu manu re re rongaroa e. Tui, 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 tui a e runga, tui a e raro, tui a e waho, tui a e roto, tui, tui, tui a. Ka rongo te ao, ka rongo te po, tui, tui, tui a. The tui, a much-loved New Zealand bird, darts hither, thither, from above and below, in and out. The lively flight of the tui demonstrates another definition of the term tui, to bind, to lace, to sew, or thread on a string. Similarly, Alan Preston and I will construct a story of the development of contemporary jewellery in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Fingers Gallery in context of time and place. We will weave this story from a number of directions. Alan has some anecdotes from those times he will share. We will both give an overview of selected national, political and cultural influences. It is these influences that distinguish New Zealand jewellery from other international practices because of where we are in the world. And out of this dynamic context, Fingers Gallery was established to become the longest serving contemporary jewellery gallery on the planet.
New Zealand is a group of islands in a region of the Pacific Ocean called Polynesia, or Oceania, once referred to as the South Sea Islands. Auckland, the largest city in New Zealand, is home of the largest Polynesian population in the Pacific.
Pacific nations today have their own culture, but once were more closely related. Adornments were once traded throughout the Pacific. Tonga and Samoa canoe makers made the breastplates that Fijian chiefs wore. Marquesas mourning costumes were made to trade with Captain James Cook and early explorers. Archaeological evidence, however, has revealed only a few articles that were transported to Aotearoa, New Zealand from Polynesia. The connections can be found through language, related oral histories, customs and technologies. Māori oral traditions tell a story of the demigod Maui, who was renowned for fishing up the North Island, called Te Ika a Maui, the fish of Maui, from his canoe, which later became Te Waipounamu, the South Island, and Rakiura, Stewart Island, was the anchor stone. The narrative is a whakapapa, or cultural genealogy, explaining the creation and the relationship of the three islands of Aotearoa, New Zealand, being a fish, a canoe, and an anchor stone. Around about 1280 AD, voyaging canoes with migrants from Polynesia arrived on our shores. They were skilled voyagers and had the seafaring knowledge to traverse vast distances of thousands of miles. One theory is these early ancestors settled in the north end of the South Island. then dispersed throughout the country. The early peoples would later become known as Māori, brought a culture with them, including adornment traditions, which quickly adapted to the new environment. Māori manufactured adornments from the new materials available. Materials and tools were often transported by wearing them. Over the centuries, there were comprehensive processing sites, the equivalent of factories, for the manufacture of ornaments, particularly of pounamu, New Zealand nephrite jade, evident by archaeological sites and oral histories. Objects were traded and traced all over the country. So Aotearoa New Zealand has a unique adornment history of its own in the world.
I've got a comment to make about the archaeological sites. At the beginning, there was a slide of my house and a view of Muruwai Beach where I live, and I discovered a while ago that down in Maukatia, which is Maori Bay, you've been down there with me, Otto, one time, all of the sinker stones for fishing that have been found throughout the Auckland region were made there, on that site. I mean, there are all sorts of other sites where they could be made, but that's where they were all made, and presumably traded amongst people as well. Now, the voyage journals of explorers Tasman in 1642, Cook, Banks and Forster 1769 to 76, de Surville 1769, Dufresne 1772, and D'Urville 1824, Laplace 1830, were explorers who provide 17th and 18th century observations of Maori they encountered on arrival. The first Western view of early Maori and their personal adornments were illustrated by artists such as Gilsman, Hodges, Weber, and Parkinson. Some up there. 18th and 19th century contributions to the body of knowledge also came from missionaries, whalers, and sealers. Some of the scientific evidence of the earliest peoples, and particularly the personal adornment, was unfortunately excavated from graves and extensively documented by archaeologists and ethnologists. We haven't mentioned that all of those early European ones are recorded, but people have evidence that Spanish came, and possibly even before Tasman. We don't know. There are some mysterious objects that have been found.
I guess these are some of our connections to Europe. Tangata whenua, the people of the land of Aotearoa New Zealand, had their own view too. Here is a local person's view of tangata pora, the people of the ships, a rock drawing of a sailing ship on a cave shelter of my ancestral area. The Enlightenment period spanning the 17th and 18th century was a European scientific revolution, resulting in research and intrigue of other peoples. The premise of advancing knowledge and collection of data for learning and entertainment objectified cultural production and the cultural producers themselves. Artefacts, including wearable objects, amongst others, were exchanged, stolen, gifted and collected, often uplifted from Aotearoa New Zealand and set down into other countries, new contexts. They would find their way into wundakama, curiosity acquisitions that eventually contributed to public collections and the museum models we know today. The written, recorded history of early Māori and Indigenous adornment has largely been dominated by scientific authorities.
The abundant resources of a newly discovered New Zealand lead to a wave of early traders, British, Americans and French activity from sealers, whalers, missionaries and entrepreneurs. Maoris serviced whaling ships and travelled the globe. The early forming of New Zealand was without law and order, however. There was rivalry over commercial links and land acquisition, which led to initiatives to regulate contracts and disputes over land between Maori and non-Maori. The solution was the annexation of New Zealand by the British government, who planned a treaty with Māori, and Māori were promised equal rights as British citizens.
New Zealand still honours the Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840 by 500 Māori chiefs, including an ancestor of mine, and a representative of the Crown. It is a complicated document at the heart of much contention. There were different understandings, expectations of the treaty by both treaty partners that have taken 176 plus years to settle. Some implications of the treaty in New Zealand society are: Te reo, the Māori language, is an official language spoken at many occasions, heard on public television, radio, place names, on signage, etc. Bank cheques can be written in Māori. Treaty principles underpin all government department policies and practices. Treaty principles underpin all government projects, and Māori tribal agencies are statutory partners in the rebuild of Christchurch City, post-earthquake, 2010. Tikanga Māori or Māori customs, cultural customs, are practised and celebrated in everyday contexts. For example, the first day at a child's school may often involve a pōwhiri, a Māori ceremony of welcome. This slide shows the Right Honourable David Carter, the Speaker of the House of Representatives who chairs New Zealand Parliament. For his official regalia, he wears a kahu torua, or cape made out of flax fibre and albatross feathers, that is said to symbolise goodwill, honour and peace to the House of Representatives.
Areta, have you noticed that Mr. Speaker was wearing a tie with camels on it?
We like to mix it up as well.
I think it's great. See, it is, isn't it? Do you think so?
I hadn't noticed.
Anyway, I've got a story relevant to Mr. Speaker. For a short time, we had a Conservative Prime Minister, whose politics I didn't agree with, called Jenny Shipley. However, Jenny wore contemporary jewellery, and she is a supporter of fingers. And when Jens Hansen, who she also supported, died, she gave a tribute to him in Parliament. And when Madeleine Albright came over for APEC, she asked Fingers to remain open late for her. They didn't turn up, because Madeleine wanted to get another pin, I think. And when President Clinton came with his daughter, he'd left Hillary behind because there was a bit of trouble at home, I think, you may remember. And Jenny sent her children to shop for an Alan Preston coconut brooch for Chelsea. And I've got it in my pocket somewhere, I think. I'll put it on later. And this is Jens, who she made the tribute to.
Okay. Both Indigenous culture and settler culture form a constitutional compact under the treaty. The influence of the treaty is the reason why Kiwis have embraced the waiata, and concluding a speech with a song of support, and why this story of New Zealand jewellery development must include Māori adornment and Māori cultural perspectives. What does this have to do with Fingers contemporary jewellery? The emphasis we'd like to make here is the Treaty of Waitangi and our history of colonisation has formed a unique dynamic in New Zealand.
I was trying to put on Jens's brooch, but I'll have to put it there at the moment, seeing we were talking about Jens. Now, from World War I and II, returned servicemen, as an outcome of the Depression between the wars, were making paua jewellery under a restricted licence as souvenirs in the disabled soldiers' stores throughout the country. There are some examples of them there. And these stores stocked carved wooden objects made by members of the World War II Māori battalion. A generation later, Austrian, German, and Samoan New Zealand citizens were interred in Wellington Harbour on Matu, Somes Island, similar to prisoner of war camps. They were citizens, but they were still interred because of their nationality. They manufactured power and silver souvenir jewellery for the American servicemen stationed in New Zealand during that Second World War, who were were defending the Pacific. My friend Odo Strew was interred there, and he escaped several times to the mainland. And Oscar Koberger, the grandfather of Annalise, you may have heard of her, the Olympic skier, was able to support his family somehow by sending the work off to his wife, who was Czechoslovakian and not interred. We've got another slide, I think, haven't we? During the 60s, European immigrant jewellers, namely Ida Hudig, Gunter Tamler, and Kobe Bossard, were practising silver and goldsmiths in New Zealand. Ida Hudig arrived in Aotearoa from Holland via Indonesia in 1956 and developed a range using PowerShell and silver, which could be made by outworkers. Oh, we were there.
Oh,
Are we supposed to be there? I was very aware of her work, as it was in the department stores when I was young, a young man in 1959 and 60, having just left school or whatever. Her children went to school with me. And it was this modernist style and fine technique that left a lasting impression on Fingers jewellers. The material of PowerShell would also be a feature of the next decade. We didn't fit into the style of work that Ida and Kobe and Jens were making at the time. In 1973, I returned to New Zealand from London, having been exposed to Electrum Gallery and artists like Wendy Ramshaw and Gerta Flockinger, amongst others. And when Fingers began in the 70s, there were no teaching institutions, though a little happened at Auckland University Art School Elam and Christchurch Ilam. However, there were mentors. In fact, Warwick Freeman and Pete Woods both learnt from Jens Hansen, and Kobe Bossard had Peter Mackay as his apprentice and continued to mentor people via Fluxus, which began before the tertiary courses started. In fact, Warwick had Matthew von Sturmer as a protege, and Ben Flynn learnt all he knew from Roy Mason at Fingers when he worked for us as an early shop boy.
Attending workshops by international visitors was another way people learnt how to make contemporary jewellery in New Zealand. Tutors included Aya Nakayama, David Laplante, Heinrich Forster, Johannes Kunin, Helen Akinkunen, Ono Bukhut, and others. Generally, artists were largely self-taught and mainly used books that were available at the time, such as Ralph Turner, Graham Hughes, and Opiontra. So it has been said that a visitor from Europe in the early days would not have recognised the work as contemporary jewellery. This is true of some work, but we were influenced by international makers, and Fingers made their own versions of that European work. At the time, jewellery production was not well recorded, and those archival photographic records came later. Here you go. Take it away. It's just the jump to the left.
The jump to the left, that's right. Yes. Now, David Bowie died recently, and it reminded me of the milieu when we opened Fingers. I'd seen David as we left Richard O'Brien, there's Richard up there, Rocky Horror Show in London, June 1973 it was. And I don't think I even realised that Richard was from New Zealand, but I was more interested in seeing the show. And another Conservative Prime Minister of ours, who preceded Jenny Shipley, was a narrator for one of these Rocky Horror theatre shows, and there he is in the middle. There's Rob Muldoon. I don't know if any of your politicians have been narrators for the Rocky Horror Show, but... So a year later, in 74, we opened Fingers. And then in 78, when we were setting up a show on Sunday and had the entire gallery empty for redisplay, who should appear at the window, being bought by his promoter, but David Bowie? And there was nothing for him to see, so all I could do was go out and give him an invitation to the opening the following day, on the Monday. And production companies bought work for their pop artists, like the Pointer Sisters, and then celebrities themselves started visiting to buy work on their own accord, people like Joan Armatrading and Manhattan Transfer. We've got a costume change, haven't we, Areta? I think so.
Yep.
Oh, yes, I have to take this thing out of my pocket and put it on my belt. Oh, gosh. That work? Yeah, that works, doesn't it? You see, it wasn't all about jewellery at the time. It was also about style. Thank you. This is a jacket I still have that was made by Pussyfooting, which was down the road from us. Miranda Joel from Pussyfooting made it. And I somehow managed to, when I was getting ready for this talk, I was looking for clothes to pack and there was this jacket, and I said to Areta, I better take it because it's got the rockets on from that time, which preceded some of the later work that happened.
Lapis Lazuli was an Auckland studio which held jewellery classes and rented bench space, run by Michael Ayling, a Fingers member, and Daniel Cladsby, soon to join Fingers. Punk Guaranteed Trash was a spontaneous exhibition workshopped at Lapis Lazuli. The show was a significant milestone because it introduced the use of non-precious materials in subsequent work. In 1978, Alan went to visit friends in Fiji. This led to new work to do with Pacific identity, using enamelled shells and fish on silver with real found shells.
Yeah, prior to that, I'd been making flatter sort of enamelled work. Those are some examples. So the influence of the Pacific was at our back door in New Zealand. During this time, I attended the South Pacific Festival of Arts in Rotorua, the second South Pacific Festival, and then again in Papua in 1980. These Pacific festivals included all nations from Oceania, and they occur every 4 years at a Pacific destination. Auckland, the largest Polynesian city, hosts similar Pacific festivals every year. I was asked to go to a subsequent one after Papua in Tahiti by our Arts Council, but I had to decline as Oscar Tamaru asked us to boycott it in the interests of their desire for independence from their French colonists. It was a sad thing that we couldn't go, but that's how it happened. In 1981, we held an exhibition of bone jewellery, and this was after I'd been to Papua, and it was influenced by adornment that I'd seen in both of those South Pacific Arts Festivals. That one particularly is a response to the work that people were wearing when they were performing and dancing. But unfortunately, all the boneworks were burgled. And so we presented an alternative show called Power Dreams in an attempt to rise from the ashes, I guess. And it was because PowerShell at the time then had a very kitsch image before kitsch was cool. We developed pieces using the natural curvature of the shell, and the show was really well received, by just generally by our public and by ourselves as well. Actually, it was really exciting for us to be doing that.
The 1970s and 80s was a nascent period for the burgeoning field of contemporary jewellery in New Zealand, a process of exploration, breaking rules and working out one's own direction for Aotearoa. Experimentation was very much a part of the zeitgeist of the time.
Costume change. Oh, thank you, Rita. That's too hot.
Come around here.
Here? Oh.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
The 1980s to 90s was a dynamic time in Aotearoa New Zealand. There were many political issues that fingers artists were responding to in their work. This led to some artists to develop a new form of contemporary Pacific adornment using materials and images found in the Pacific. New Zealand was involved in ongoing protests over French nuclear testing in French Polynesia since the mid-1960s. In 1972, Greenpeace sailed to the test site Mururua Atoll in protest. Subsequently, New Zealand Navy sent 2 frigates to the test site with a cabinet minister on board who witnessed atmospheric testing. These protests achieved some success when the French president of the time moved French nuclear testing underground, resulting in further anti-nuclear protest. In the 80s, nuclear-free protests continued against nuclear-armed armed ships visiting New Zealand.
So the general public opinion agreed with David Longy, our then Prime Minister, a Labour Prime Minister, not Conservative, a radical Prime Minister, when he said that there's only one thing worse than being incinerated by your enemies, and that's being incinerated by your friends. He also, at the Oxford debate, I don't know if you know, when he was debating with Jerry Falwell, an American congressman, to try and put his case for nuclear ships not visiting our country and us being nuclear free, he told him to please close his mouth because he could smell the uranium on his breath. He did.
In 1987, New Zealand was officially and legally nuclear free. During the 1981 Springbok rugby tour from South Africa, there were massive protests against apartheid for months, resulting in the sabotage of rugby games and many arrests. Nelson Mandela subsequently visited New Zealand to thank his supporters. In 1985, the Greenpeace boat, Rainbow Warrior, was sunk by French government terrorists in Auckland. The guilty agents, Dominique Prieur and Alan Mafar, were caught by observant citizens. The badge of Commandos Marine is represented here in this repoussé brooch by Alan.
Yes, at the time, you can go back to Commandos Marine if you want to read it. Oh, I don't know if it went back. Here. At the time, I was making a series of work about sovereignty, and I was using badges from those shops that sell, military sort of stuff. And by chance, I came across this badge, which I've pressed into the silver, and it was the badge of that terrorist group, Commandos Marine. And I don't know if it's clear for you from the image, but the image is of a sword going through a sailing ship, an old sailing ship. And it was I couldn't believe that was the badge they had when they just sunk our Greenpeace Rainbow Warrior in the harbour. So that's why that one happened.
All right, next.
So my work in this show is the result of the Republican movement, which Bruce Jesson initiated. Bruce is now dead, sadly. So the Kiwi attacks the crown brooches, etc., there were many Kiwis who felt Aotearoa New Zealand should leave the British monarchy and Commonwealth behind and become a republic. Bruce, who founded the Republican movement, was charged with offensive behaviour for yelling out "Go home, Pom" to the Queen of England. But he was discharged, as he said when defending himself, that she couldn't have been offended as she was smiling and waving throughout.
Okay. Land issues still continued for Māori because the Treaty of Waitangi guaranteed to Māori rangatiratanga, which translates loosely as Māori's sovereignty rights over land. In 75 to 83, Takaparawa, Bastion Point, Māori land was to be sold by New Zealand government for private housing. The land was occupied by Ngāti Whātua, a tribal group in Auckland who rightly owned it, and were forcibly removed from the land through arrest. This land has subsequently been repatriated. The most celebrated Māori land march of 75, known as the Hikoi, meaning to walk, was led by Māori elder Pinakothek in her 80s. Later to be knighted, Dame Pinakothek mobilised the Māori population to walk in protest from the top of the North Island to Parliament in Wellington at the bottom of the North Island, gathering momentum as they went. The Waitangi Tribunal was established in 1975 when protests about unresolved treaty grievances climaxed. The tribunal is a commission of inquiry for Māori regarding grievances relating to breach of promises made by the Treaty of Waitangi. Addressed grievances have resulted in government apologies and acts of Parliament returning Crown land and monetary compensation, etc., and has reset frameworks towards equality between treaty partners moving forward. Te Māori, an international touring exhibition in the 1980s led by Sydney Mead, was a celebrated comprehensive exhibition of Māori art and culture. The exhibition Te Māori was indicative of a Māori renaissance, a self-determined response by Māori to express a living culture in their own terms, through all sectors such as education and health. In arts, this Māori self-determination provoked a change in museum practice and knowledge domain pertaining to Māori cultural objects nationally and internationally. Te Māori was an important moment when Māori culture came to be seen as central to New Zealand identity, both at home and in the way the country was represented abroad.
So at this time, Dame Georgina Kirby, who was a customer of ours and who was teaching me Māori language, asked if she could borrow a piece of Roy Mason to take to the opening of Te Māori in New York. And when she came back and returned it, she said, I told them it was made by my cousin. And Roy was really delighted to hear that. I was learning
no
Māori
relation.
language no, at the time. And most Pākehā New Zealanders, I'm Pākehā, don't speak Te Reo Māori, and a lot of Māori don't speak it either, because when my generation of Māori, when they were at school, were punished for speaking the language. They wanted them to speak English, not to speak Māori. Yeah. However, that's not what it's like now. It's spoken widely by Māori people. Yeah, and a number of Pākehā too.
Ongoing Māori critique, myth-busting and generating of Māori critical theory, alongside public expositions, has influenced how Māori treasures are valued and understood today. The term taonga is recognised by Waitangi Tribunal as a treasured possession, including property, resources, and abstract concepts such as language, cultural knowledge, and even relationships. Both tangible and intangible dimensions are encompassed in the notion of taonga as heirlooms, handed on, maintained through close contact with people.
The use of Pacific material and images resulted in an identifiable fingers style, and this was recognised by James Mack at the Dowse Art Museum, the director at the time, also who later changed his name to Galvin McNamara, because that was one of his relatives. All of the men of that generation were named after electrical terms, and one of them was Galvin. And also, the New Zealand Crafts Council asked James, Edith Ryan and Kobe Bossard to select a show called Bone Stone Shell, which some of you may have heard about already, and which Lisa has done some amazing work in response to. Yes. It was toured in 1988 by Foreign Affairs to Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, Perth in Australia, then Japan. And at the time, the Dowse Art Museum and Auckland Museum were the only public institutions collecting contemporary jewellery. The audience recognised and identified with the fingers style and adopted these fingers symbols to express their own identity. When that show, Bone Stone Shell, went to Australia, incidentally, it was going at the time of their bicentenary of European occupation, and I said that I would have no part in it if they weren't acknowledging the Koori, who are the Aboriginal people in Australia. So they deferred and took the show there, but didn't take it as an official show celebrating that occupation of the country. We have a costume change, haven't we, to lighten things up a bit, Areta? Yes, well, we need to... there we are. This is a further development of Bone Stone Shell work. How's that for the height?
Thank you. Perfect.
You put it where you want it. Good. Yeah, the subsequent work that I did, some of the images are seen as being Pacific, but in fact they were using shapes from churches, architecture, and so on. And in fact, that one is from the church where my great-grandparents are buried, one of the first churches built actually in New Zealand, the first wooden, in Te Awamutu. Who's talking now, Areta?
You are.
Oh, yeah, right, okay. So on return to New Zealand, the Bone Stone Shell show, the works were all purchased by the Friends of Te Papa, our national museum. And this generous acquisition formed the beginning of the contemporary jewellery collection at Te Papa Tongarewa. They were latecomers to the scene, really. Dowse Art Museum with James Mack was buying and acquiring works much earlier. Te Papa have continued to do that. They now do. So another distinctive style came out of the Fluxus Jewellery Workshop and Gallery, which was located in Dunedin, near the bottom of our country, in the South Island. And Fluxus members were producing work in the modernist style influenced by Swiss-born Kobe Bossard, whose work you see there, and German-born Georg Beer.
Contemporary jewellery then became available as a tertiary studio program onwards from 1985. The initiative was thanks to a handful of jewellers who visited the JMGA, Jewellers and Metalsmith Group in Australia, the conference in '84, and then formed their own Kiwi network called Details. These Details members propelled themselves energetically into the education discussion between the craft sector, tertiary institutions and the government. These jewellers would become tutors of the early craft courses, and I was a student in the early intake of those courses. Until very recently, New Zealand has supported 5 main tertiary programs throughout the country, catering for certificate, diploma, degree and postgrad levels in studio jewellery. Professor Peter Deckers coordinates one of these successful jewellery programs at Aotearoa New Zealand for many years. By 1990, graduates were being represented by Fingers and other galleries. The generation of tertiary trained jewellers began to make an impact on New Zealand jewellery in the 1990s because they made quite different work to the mostly self-taught generation that preceded them. Workshop 6 was a collective studio in Auckland established in 1993 by graduates, including Lisa Walker and myself. This shared studio is still going 23 years later. Fingers and Fluxes were selling work not only from the established artists, but also from emerging makers. By the end of the 90s, the contemporary jewellery field in New Zealand had a strong, confident identity and following. The genre was supported by an audience educated by Fingers and Fluxes. In a small country like New Zealand, contemporary jewellery could be spotted on national television, worn by newsreaders or sports commentators, or hired for actors to wear on screen. Blockbuster movies like Lord of the Rings and Last Samurai employed graduate jewellers for making jewellery objects as part of their wardrobe.
Yes, you didn't mention that Jasmine did all the jewellery for Lord of the Rings, one of our students. That was the reason that I went to see only one of the movies. I wanted to see what the jewellery looked like. So as was said before, we've represented over 107, or not over, around, it was hard counting them up, 170 artists over the years, and currently we've got 60 emerging and established artists, and we're well situated directly opposite the Auckland City Art Gallery, and that was just fortuitous because we were in the street below for 13 years. We went up there in 1987, not knowing that it was going to coincide with the stock market crash. And the reason we had to go was because the building we were in the 80s was going to be demolished and pulled down, and our lease had run out. We only had monthly tenancy, so we needed to find somewhere to go, and that brand new building was there, and we got it. And it's a great place to be because it not only looks out over the art gallery, but that way there is Albert Park, and so you're looking out into trees and greenery, and it's a fabulous place to be for us. It's still run by 5 makers, and we employ staff. We don't have a curatorial statement. We've never been a legal entity. We're a common partnership. And edgier sort of exhibition works are exhibited alongside limited editions and bread and butter works, I would say. I'd say that we're a deeply flawed gallery because we're not run by a gallerist. We're run by a group of makers and often don't have time to make decisions or disagree with things. And that's partly why we're still there, I think. So currently at home in New Zealand, contemporary jewellery enjoys a healthy climate, and fine art dealers, galleries in most New Zealand cities. And for a population of 4.663 million, we have a large number of public and private galleries exhibiting contemporary jewellery. We've made a list of the ones there. I hope we haven't missed anybody out, don't think so. And you could say that the galleries, especially those run by makers alongside tertiary courses also run by makers, have developed a community over time and contributed to community consciousness. Galleries have become centres for engaging with the discourse and the jewellery community, and we enjoy visitors.
Exhibitions are well attended and supported by the cross-section of our jewellery community: artists, galleries, curators, writers, historians, collectors and wearers. Aotearoa New Zealand doesn't have any membership structure or hierarchy. Communications are very immediate. Access to public institutions and expertise is also very direct. Graduates mix easily with established makers, and graduate shows are an annual occurrence. If we want to arrange a jewellery forum, people come together to make it happen. A special visitor will be looked after by a network from the North to the South Island. This is probably also an outcome of being a small country where information and opportunities are readily shared, and we love visitors.
The tertiary institutions, galleries and the public sector have invited, or not the public sector, the jewellery sector, have invited many international guests over the years for workshops and forums. New Zealand artists are motivated and mobilised. They travel extensively and are connected nationally and internationally now. So the period of development that we find ourselves in is difficult to define. We could perhaps think of it as a time for critical reflection, critical writing or rewriting in one's own terms. Damien Skinner has been one of the prolific catalysts producing publications about contemporary jewellery in New Zealand and in Australasia in collaboration with Kevin Murray. And jewellery practices have been examined in the light of broader cultural contexts such as Kobe bossard and modernism in New Zealand. We're here because when we were asked by Petra to speak, Warwick and I conferred and said, well, we really must ask Damien, because Damien has done so much for us in terms of writing about his work, our work, and other people's work, but Damien, for some reason, couldn't come or didn't want to come, I'm not sure. We were going to confer with him about how the talk would be, but it hasn't happened because I live in the North Island, Areta lives in the South Island, and getting together to make this talk has been very difficult, in that way. But Damien would have been quite happy to help us. In fact, he had ideas.
I'm glad he didn't.
Didn't he? You're glad he didn't? Okay.
Costume change.
Costume change? Oh, really? Oh, thank you, Areta. Oh, thank you. Oh, that's great. Who's talking?
Critical discussions about contemporary jewellery from a Māori worldview are in short supply, and from a Māori maker's worldview are scarce. This is a contribution a few Māori curators have been able to make, and that I've been able to make as a Māori artist over 25 years. To unlock historic Māori adornment or contemporary Māori adornment, or contemporary Māori jewellery, meaningfully or to a deeper level, means engaging with Māori people and Māori cultural values in the present time and place. Māori principles have been articulated into Māori critical theory and research and utilised in education in Aotearoa New Zealand for 20 years now. This body of collective Māori knowledge is called kaupapa Māori. Right. Key principles from kaupapa Māori that have guided my process include taonga tuku iho, tangible and intangible cultural treasures passed on. This is a Māori cultural aspiration to empower and transform people, knowledge and objects in the way we do things. Whakapapa, genealogy or provenance, as a process means looking for relationships and connections. I've had to shift my mindset to think collectively, not individually, to consider a process that could take others with me and accept a caretaker's role of their knowledge contribution. Tino rangatiratanga, sovereignty, self-determination. To look for outcomes that are of benefit to the Māori community, of benefit to the jewellery community and others, because as an individual, I can contribute to future generations. Whānau, extended family, and ako, transfer of knowledge. This involves being a face seen, kānohi ki te kānohi, being someone that people know, being a participant in the community, as well as discussion and consultation with elders. Yeah. Ako, to teach and learn. Making art is critical to processing ideas. It's also a method for transfer of knowledge. These Māori principles have helped guide the form of our talk today.
This work of mine was called foreshore. I did white foreshore and black foreshore. And it came at a time when there was a lot of debate about who owns the foreshore. And the person who's actually responsible for it happening is somebody that you all might know. He's called Otto Kunzli. He asked me to be in a show called Micromegas. And I thought, I don't know what I'm going to do. And so I went for a walk on the beach, and I found a great piece of broken shell, which I wear on the coat that I've got here, actually. And I made this pin. But I didn't send it to you, Otto. Instead, I sent a stone from Maori Bay, where we had been, from that site where all of the sinker stones have been made. Just a little one, but a stone nevertheless. And it was my foreshore series was about a famous series of paintings by Colin McCann, who's one of our artists now dead, famous artists, and he lived where I live at Muruai Beach, and he painted several series of walks along Muruai Beach. They were big series of paintings that went quite a long way, maybe even at least the length of this room, or possibly even double. And Colin's the grandfather of Finn McCann-Jones, who co-wrote this book with Damien. And our National Museum now owns that work of his, and they'd also bought my foreshore work. I always wanted the foreshore work to be there because of Colin's work, but what I never thought would ever happen would be that they'd be shown together. And recently, Justine Olsen did a show of Bonestone, I'm going like this because of the light, Bonestone Shell 25 years later, because they owned the Bonestone Shell collection, but it had never been displayed in full. And it was a wonderful show, the Bonestone Shell show, with all the contemporary jewellery that they've collected. And they had a Colin foreshore walk series leading into the show, and then at the other end of it was my foreshore series leading out of it. So I was so delighted for that to have happened that I don't need to do any more, much, really. Kamutu tēnei kōrero. Haere mai.
We're going to conclude
Haere mai.
With a waiata.
Haere mai.
Okay. Te aroha, te
whakapono, te rangi Māori e, tātou e, anō. Te aroha, te whakapono, me te rangi Māori e, tātou e. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, take a photo, tēnā tātou katoa.
That's us. Fini. Thank you.
Areta's place. We started with my place, we've ended with Areta's place. Yep.